Hey there, Father Michael, long time no see. It's a long, complicated story. Technical issues, Facebook jail, and health, physical health reasons. So here we are. One of, I think, the deepest wounds that we humans tend to carry around, tend to suffer from, is that deep feeling that somehow we're not good enough. We are unworthy, unlovable, irredeemable, unforgivable for whatever tomfoolery we have engaged in. I see this literally every day with my clients trying to break free of their addictive behaviors, whether it's alcohol or drugs or gambling or hypersexuality. I've spent hours, I would say I spend hours every single week trying to get some of them to admit, at least in principle, that they're not the worst human who ever lived, that they actually might be within the parameters of normal human behavior. A few years ago, I had a young man stuck in this attitude of self-loathing and self-judgment. And the problem was, of course, that nothing good was coming his way. And in fact, it was fueling a cycle of continuing relapse after relapse after relapse. And so I am after him. We're in a session one evening, trying to get him to dig a little bit deeper and figure out why he was so hard on himself and what he might do to make that just a little bit better. Well, he kept insisting that he should not be forgiven for all of the crappy things that he did. Okay, so he had lied repeatedly to his employer, his family, his spouse. He had stolen money and property from family members and friends. He had ducked out of participating in family events and holiday gatherings in order to get drugs. In other words, the usual for addicts. I reassured him again and again that he hadn't done anything any worse than anybody else. And so we talked about what it would take for him to be able to maybe forgive himself for all of that nonsense. And he insisted that just wasn't going to happen for him, that everybody else on the planet could be forgiven, should be forgiven, but probably not him, because he was the worst. Well, so I jumped on that and I said, okay, so you're the worst. So you're worse than, let's say, a rapist? Yes, he said. Okay, you're worse than a serial killer? Yes. They should be forgiven before I should be forgiven. I said, what about Adolf Hitler? Are you worse than Adolf Hitler? And he said, absolutely, yes. Hitler should be forgiven before me. And I just let that sit there for a moment. And it finally hit him what had just come out of his mouth. And he said, I'm kind of effed up on this, aren't I? I'm like, bro, yes, you are. That feeling of radical unworthiness, I think, is common to a lot of us. And it reminds me of the call of the prophet Moses in the book of Exodus. So on the one hand, Moses is kind of in tune with his spirituality, and he feels deep within himself a call from God to step up and lead the people of Israel out of slavery. And he felt the attraction of the divine call, and he felt, the potential for power and purpose if he were to answer this divine call. But on the other hand, he was completely preoccupied with his perceived shortcomings. He felt totally inadequate and reluctant in the extreme. Who am I, God? He says. I'm not good enough. You can do better. I'm a crappy public speaker. I'm going to mess this up. I'm not going to say the right words, and nobody's going to listen to me. And in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, we have Yahweh's response to him. The text says, Moses said to Yahweh, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And Yahweh said, "I am with you. I am with you." In other words, God effectively turned the focus away from Moses and put the emphasis where it belonged, on God's own power. God absolutely promised Moses that he would find the right words in the moment. He would know what to say once he got into the situation. And when Moses continued to argue, when his fear continued to resurface, again, terrified that no one would ever listen to someone like him, God revealed God's name, by which he would bind himself to Moses and to all of us for all time. And Yahweh said, "I am who I am." And ever since, we have referred to the God of creation, the one power and the one presence, as YHWH, Yahweh. We can all relate to Moses. We can all relate to those feelings of not being good enough, those feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness. We think we need to be perfect, or at least a whole lot better than we are, before we can do any of God's work. We think that we have to wait until we feel 100% confident and capable before we even consider starting to serve God and God's purposes. And to be sure, because we have felt unworthy and not good enough, we have all missed opportunities to share our faith. We've declined invitations from God to step up and do something for somebody else. We've all sometimes just turned away and chosen to do nothing to help someone who really could have used a little comfort from us. All of that stems not because we're bad, but because we're afraid we might be not good enough. In a certain sense, we're never going to be 100% perfectly capable, totally confident, totally competent, totally in line with our own giftedness. I get that. Nonetheless, God still chooses us exactly as we are, exactly where we are. And that means maybe we're not worse than Hitler. Maybe we're not the worst POS to have lived in the history of humanity. Maybe we are more than good enough. The Hebrew scriptures tell us that when Moses tried to act on his own, relying only on his own strengths and insights and ideas, he was rejected and eventually banished from Egypt. But when Moses returned at God's invitation, tapping into God's power and purposes, then the people actually listened and they followed Moses and they became unified as one nation. With God's help, you and I are absolutely good enough. We're deserving. We are worthy of all the blessings that surround us at every moment. And when we feel inadequate and too broken and wounded perhaps to do anything worth doing, we need to remember that it is in our brokenness and our woundedness that God's power is made manifest and made perfect, just as the risen Jesus revealed his wounds to the disciples on that first Easter evening. So too, we can reveal the presence of God through our own wounds. It's not that we are unworthy. It's that we are absolutely good enough and perfect to the task at hand. Pray with me. Loving, mighty God, the great I am, we come into your presence in this moment, humbly asking that you help us heal our woundedness, in particular our feelings of not being enough. Show us today that we do have a purpose in this life, that we can change not only our own heart, but by our loving, we can give comfort and strength to other hearts. For all the times when we have felt inadequate and unworthy, we ask your patience. Help us to realize that we do not need to be perfect, that we are perfectly good the way we are right now. And let us not miss any opportunities today to share our best self with those you send us. Amen. Have a great day.